I'll go underneath.
Thank you.
That's good. Thank you. It's very good.
Sorry.
Akari b'Torah. If you're reading the Torah, with every aliyah, there should be at least 3 psukim. The translator should not do more than 1 pasuk at a time of translation, so people will be able to hold cup. V'navi shlosha, and in the Navi, in the Haftorah, the translator can translate 3 psukim at a time. And even if it's a little bit harder for him to remember the translations of 3 psukim at a time, if he makes a little bit of a mistake, it's not the end of the world. People aren't going to end up having the wrong interpretation of Torah rules if it's only the Haftorah that's being read. Shalosh Parshios,
Now we're
if the 3
talking about in between the Turgaman.
You were talking about, can the Metorgaman, wait for 3 psukim before starting his translation? So in the Torah, he has to translate 1 pasuk at a time, so make sure to really be concentrating properly and to give the right translation. And in the Haftorah, if it's 3 psukim at a time, even though it might be harder for him to hold up and do everything so precisely, we're not worried about precision as much in the Haftorah because there aren't Torah laws in the Haftorah. If the 3 different psukim of the Haftorah are 3 totally different inyanim, that they're like 3 different sections, so then you can only translate 1 at a time because they're 3 totally different chapters. You can skip from one Navi to another Navi in the middle, but you can't skip from one section of the Torah to another section of the Torah in the middle of the Kriya. But when you are allowed to skip, then how much are you allowed to skip? So it seems that Rashi says that Pashut Pshat is that we're talking about in the Navi, because we just say you're not allowed to skip altogether in the Torah. You can only skip because the amount of time that the translator would still be in the middle of translating the previous pasuk or set or series of psukim before you turn to the appropriate section where you're going to continue the Haftorah, so that there won't be any kind of communal interruption in the middle. Gemara says, according to whom does it correspond? If we're going to have a rule that you have to have at least 3 psukim, it has to correspond to something when Ola gets up and reads. So Amar Ravasi Kenegatorin Nevi'im Miksuvim, it corresponds to 3 different sections of Tanakh. So we said in the Mishnah, the translator in the Torah should not translate more than 1 pasuk at a time in the Haftorah and not more than 3 psukim at a time. But if the 3 different psukim in the Haftorah are 3 different sections, like correspond to 3 different chapters, they're just very short chapters, so then you can only read 1 at a time. What would be an example of that? 3 psukim in a row that all are speaking about different themes. So we have that in Yeshayahu, Perek Nun Beis. Yeshayahu Nun Beis. First pasuk says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I sent you into Galus for no price. The next pasuk is a different theme. First you went down to Egypt, and then the third pasuk speaks about the Galus of Edom. And this pasuk is speaking about the Galus of Edom. So 3 different themes in a row. Each one would have to have its own separate translation, and you couldn't translate all 3 at the same time. You're allowed to skip in the Navi and from one place to another, but not from in the Torah from one place to another. But we have in the Kohen Gadol read on Yom Kippur, he skipped from Acharei Mos to a pasuk in Emor. He says Korei Acharei Mos. He starts off with Vayikra Tes Zayin, and then Va'akvi Asur, the Chodesh Hashvi'i, and then he goes to a parsha in Emor, which is a couple of sections later in the Torah. And yet he's skipping. Yet we said in the Mishnah that in the Torah we don't allow any kind of skipping. So Amar Abaye, no, the Mishnah is talking about if there are 2 different themes, you can't skip from one to another in the Torah. Amar Abaye Lokasha Kamek Yivso Katorgaman Kankadesh Lo Yivso Katorgaman. The first answer Abaye says is that when is it that you're allowed to skip? You're allowed to skip when the translator is still in the middle of translating, and before he finishes translating the previous pasuk, you already turned the Torah to the section where you're going to continue. But the Mishnah had said the word Allah does not necessarily belong over here. The Mishnah had said Medalgim Minavi, They Medalgim Mitayra. that we don't allow skipping in the Torah altogether. And even when we allow skipping in the Navi, it has to be only the amount of time that the translator had not yet finished translating the previous pasuk with Klal. So from that, we can infer, from that line in the Mishnah, we can infer the B'Torah Klal Lo, that in the Torah, even if the translator is still in the middle of translating the previous line, you're still not allowed to skip from one section to another section. So how do we allow the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur to skip from one section to another, from Akrei Mos to Emor, to Elam Abaye? So Abaye answers, Lo Kasha Kaming Yanechad Kam B'Shtei Yono. So here's where Abaye gives the final punchline. It depends if it's along the lines of the same theme and the Torguman is not finished translating the previous pasuk, then you're allowed to roll from one section to another, like from Akrei Mos to Emor. But if it's Shtei Yonos, but if it's two different themes, so then we only allow you to roll from one place to another in the Haftorah, in the Navi, but not in the Torah. And even in the Haftorah, it has to be B'Ktei Shlo Yifsach HaTorguman. The Hatanya, and here this is a brisa that is B'dichusa, it's a support, not a kasha, but a support. Brisa says along these lines, you are allowed to skip it from one place to another place in the Torah if it's in the same theme. And in the Navi, we allow you to skip from one place to another place, even with respect to two different themes. But in both places, it's only as long as there's no tircha tzibura, because the translator is still in the middle of his translation from the previous pasuk that was just read. We have another brisa that says, we never allow you to skip from one navi to another navi. Yes, Eddie?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, when we were learning Yuma, he reads Akrei Mos from the Sefer, then he's Golol the Sefer Torah to Emor.
Correct.
But then he does Baal Peh
In Pinchas.
in Pinchas.
Yotem Mashikasavti Kasuka. Yotem Mashikarasi Kasuka. Yes. Emedagim Minavi Lanavi, because that's way too far away. Emedagim Minavi Lanavi. So the other brisa says very good. So we don't skip from one navi to another navi. But we do allow the skipping within. We don't allow you to skip from, let's say, Yeshayahu to Yirmiyahu, from Yirmiyahu to Yechezkel. But if it's Treyasar, that is all considered to be one sefer, and you're allowed to skip, for example, from Yoel to Micha. So as long as you don't go backwards, so you're reading from a clock, you wouldn't be allowed to go, let's say, from backwards from Micha to Yoel, from Yoel to Hosea. You can only go do that if you're not reading from a clock. Okay, Mishnah, Naya Mishnah, Hamaftiv and Navi, that comes up in Shabbat Shua. Hamaftiv and Navi, who pares al Shema, a person who's reading the Haftorah. So we allow him, if we have anticipated, but that he's going to read the Navi, and it's not considered to, in other words, he gets maftir, which is not considered to be the most honorific type of aliyah, because technically speaking, he's not really there to read from the Torah. He already read from the Torah. He's really, so it's sort of a lower level. So we compensate him by allowing him to split up the Shema. Splitting up the Shema is a question of what it means. If it means that people already daven, but they didn't daven B'tzibur, now the B'tzibur, so they have one person say Yishtabach and Baruch Hu and the first pasuk and the first bracha of Shema, so everybody can answer Kadosh, 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 and Baruch Hu Hashem and come on. Another interpretation is you have somebody who doesn't know how to read the first bracha by himself, so you can have another person say it in order to be motzi him. So that's a part of like being motzi the tzibur. So it's an honor, not quite on the same level as say Chazaras Hashatz, but it's still considered to be an honorable thing to do. And secondly, secondly, he does Chazaras Hashatz. He serves as the Shliach Tzibur. They were talking about Peshacharis, so it means either it's a later day in the week that we're compensating him, or we knew that he was going to do he's going to get maftir that day, so therefore we anticipate ahead of time that we give him these special honors. Who knows say as a kappa, and let's say that he's one of a bunch of kohanim, but everybody in the shul is a kohen, so you need some kohanim to be there as part of the tzibur to receive the bracha, and only a couple of kohanim are going to duchen, so we'll allow him to be one of the kohanim who duchens. And if he was a katan, so then Aviv, and he can't therefore lead the tzibur, we allow him to get maftir, because a katan's allowed to get maftir, but we don't allow him to lead the tzibur in, he can't be motzi them, yidei chovasan. So then we give the honor of serving as the shliach tzibur to his father or to his rebbe. Aviv Arabo Ovrin Ayado. Katan, what can a katan generally do? We allow him to read from the Torah because he doesn't have to be motzi anybody, an obligation, because it's more of a communal obligation to read from the Torah. So we allow a katan to do it, not to get all the aliyahs, but to get one or two, and certainly to read to get the aliyah of maktir. We allow, strictly speaking, it's not our practice in our shul per se, but strictly speaking, a katan could get maktir. Katan kare b'Torah u'mitargim, and he can also serve as the translator. About Eno, but he can't do anything to be motzi other people. So if it's the first bracha of Kriya Shema, according to either interpretation that we gave, well, Eno pares al Shema, Eno over l'fnei hateva, and he also can't obviously serve as the shliach tzibor for chazaras hashatz. Eno no say as kappa, and interestingly enough, we say here that he generally speaking doesn't duchen. So Tosfos brings other gemaras that indicate that it would be okay for a katan to dochen. It says in Lulav Hagazel that once a katan knows how to dochen, we allow him to do so. We could give him truma, even if he's an actual katan. So Tosa says that's talking about when he's dochening together with older kohanim, but we don't allow a katan to dochen if he's the only kohen doing the dochening. Pocheach pares shema. A person who is a pocheach. The question what pocheach means. Rashi seems to indicate that it means somebody who is not only barefoot, but he doesn't have any pants below his knees, so that the lower portion of his leg is completely uncovered. In other words, somebody is wearing shorts. A person is wearing shorts, and according to Rashi, according to Tosos, it means somebody with tattered clothing. Pares Shema Umitargim will allow him to do this sort of limited shliach tzibor honor, which is not so me'akev of leading people in the first bracha of Kriya Shema. Umitargim, and he can also serve as a translator of Eno Kori B'Torah, but it's not considered to be covered a Torah if somebody with tattered clothing or who's only wearing a very short shorts would get an aliyah. Ve'eno over the Pnei Hateva, you also can't lead the tzibor in davening. So somebody who has shorts and the knee is uncovered should not be leading the tzibor in davening. Ve'eno no say as kapav, and he cannot serve as somebody who duchens. Suma Pares Shema, somebody who is vision impaired, a blind person. Pares Shema, he is allowed to lead the tzibur in the first bracha of Shema. Umetargim, and he's allowed to serve as a translator. Rabbi Yehuda Omer for the reading of the Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer koshlova moos miyam of eno pares Shema. Rabbi Yehuda says, however, that no, if he never ever had the ability to see, so that's considered to be a lower level obligation, and therefore he would not be able to be pares as a Shema. We don't say that he is considered mechuyev in the bracha himself. He's patum in a mitzvos, and therefore he can't be motzi other people. So, divide the Shema is, as I said, it's two different interpretations. One interpretation is that you have a bunch of people who already, daven, but they didn't daven, b'tzibor, and they want to be able to, say Baruch Hu and also answer to Kadosh, 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 and Baruch Hu Hashem Kamo in the first bracha of the Shema. So then they have somebody who leads them, in that. And the other interpretation is that this is talking about there's one person or more who just don't know how to do it themselves. So therefore, you have somebody who gets up and he does it, for those people who don't know how to say the bracha themselves. So it's like a limited type of shliach tzibor function for the first bracha of the Shema. Okay, the Gemara says, my type. We don't generally have this custom ourselves. We have the custom that if somebody came late to shul and they didn't hear Baruch Hu, so sometimes the person will say well of Yishtabach, and they'll say Kaddish, and then they'll say the bracha of Yishtabach, they'll say Kaddish, and they'll say Baruch Hu, and people will answer, but then they won't go on and say the entire first bracha. Okay, the Gemara says, my timer, what's some people have that custom, you'll be in shul and you'll be ready to go, and then there's somebody who came late, and suddenly he'll start saying Yishtabach, what in the world is going on over here? And the person will say Kaddish and say Baruch Hu, and you'll answer Baruch and say, okay, fine, whatever. No. Okay, so Gemara says, my timer, Papa Amma Mishum Kavod. What's the reason that the person who gets a maftir gets these extra privileges of being Pares Shema, of being over Lifnei Ateva? So we say in order to give him extra kavod, because he didn't get an aliyah from the Torah that really counts. So therefore we want to compensate him. So Rabbi Bashimi Mishum da Arsi Linsuye. And he says that Rabbi Bashimi says you'll have people who are going to fight with each other. One person will say, I'll get maftir and you'll lead the tzibur. And he will say, no. I'll get maftir and you'll lead the tzibur. And then they'll get into a fight with each other. Can't imagine that happening. So therefore, we just give one person both. So might be nice. Some say this is probably where the custom emerged. If sometimes the person who gets mafta also leads the tzibur and musaf afterwards. So might be nice. What would be a nafkamina between those two different reasons as to whether it's because of covet or whether because we want to just prevent fist fights? So ika beinayim the avi bechinam. So this is an interesting nafkamina. If the person who davens for the tzibur gets nothing out of it, meaning he doesn't get paid for it, so then people don't care about that honor so much. Yeah, tell me. Tonight, the Mishnah says, "Im haya katan avi barabo ovin ayadus." The Mishnah said, "Well, if the person got mafti was a katan, so then the father or the rebbe are the ones who lead the tzibur." So it's mishum nisuye. So if I say that it's because I want to prevent fights, so katanim don't get into fights over this type of thing, like they understand what's really important in life, not this type of narish guy. So katan banitsuye elamai mishum kavod. You'll say, oh, well, it must be that the reason why we make sure to give to the father of the rebbe is because we want kavod. But a katan also is not a person who needs kavod. Katan bar kavodu. Eliika covered Avi, we covered Rabos. The answer is that we care about, people are paying attention to the what cover their child gets because that's covered for them. So it's covered for the father, or covered for the Rebbe. We turn the page on Hanami. So too, just the same way we worried about the cover of the father of the Rebbe. So we worry that the father of the Rebbe are going to get into a fight. Hanami can see Avi, can see Rabo if they wouldn't be able to lead the tzibur in the davening. So that's the reason. It could be either explanation as to why we would give the leading of the tzibur to the father or the rebbe, either the explanation of kavod or the explanation of preventing fights would work. The person who's the bare-legged or torn clothing person can be pares al shema, but he can't otherwise lead the tzibur. So Ula Barav said, what if this person who's wearing shorts is a katan? Katan pocheach mao sheikva b'Torah. In general, we say that a katan is allowed to read the Torah. We say, however, pocheach is not allowed to get an aliyah. What if he's a katan who's wearing shorts? Because maybe that's not quite as degrading as when an adult walks into show wearing shorts. So Amalevi tibayilach arum. Why don't you ask me a katan who's just stark raving naked? Arum my time alone. Why is it that we wouldn't give it to a katan who'd be stark raving naked? Mishum covered tzibur, because it really wouldn't be covered tzibur if he was completely naked. So Achinami, if he's naked enough that he's not, that his knees are uncovered, Mishum covered tzibur would still be a problem of covered tzibur if I would give the katan the aliyah. Suma pares hashma b'chulei. The blind person can divide the shema. Tanya amalol Rabbi Yehuda habe saf lidrash from merkava lo rosa mimeim. So they said to Rabbi Yehuda had said, but if the person was never able to see, so then he wouldn't be able to lead the tzibur at all. So they said to Rabbi Yehuda, but there were people who are doresh, they give drashos about the Ma'aseh Merkava, despite the fact that they never saw the Ma'aseh Merkava, they never saw this wondrous vision that Yechezkel describes of the divine chariot, and yet they darshan about the divine chariot. So what does it matter if a person's not able to see? Rabbi Yehuda Hassam, so Rabbi Yehuda says, no, there, the seeing is through the heart, to have an understanding of what the Ma'aseh Merkava was all about. But the person has this inner understanding of the recesses of their heart, and therefore that is considered to be seeing it. They're able to see it through their heart. And therefore they're able to understand. But here, when we speak about Yosef Me'oros, we speak about the person who's going to be describing being able to see light. So they have to have an actual benefit from the light. But the person who never was able to see his entire life, he was born blind, he never had hana from the light. But the Baran, however, say, no, there is hana that even the blind person is able to get from light, as Rabbi Yossi says, famous comment of Rabbi Yossi, the Tanya Price says, Rabbi Yossi, I never understood this pasuk in Parshas Kisavo with respect to the Tochacha. You're going to fumble in the middle of the day, the same way that a blind person fumbles around at night. What difference does it make for a blind person, whether it's the nighttime or whether it's the daytime? Either way, he's going to fumble. It's going to be all darkness around him. Until I finally came, an incident occurred to me in which I was able to understand the distinction. I was walking in the thick of the night, and there was complete darkness. And I saw a poor person who was walking with a torch in his hand. The Mati Lo, I said, how come you're walking around with a torch? You can't see anyway. So he explained to me, because That as long as I have this torch, people are able to see me. And the same thing with respect to a blind person who doesn't have a torch, who's walking around in the daytime, people are able to see him. So that's the distinction between daytime and nighttime that's described in the Tochacha. And they're able to save me, said the poor person, from any holes, any potholes, and any thorns and any thistles that happen to surround me. So it's the same thing that that a blind person does benefit from the light that other people are able to see him and they're able to save him from any kind of treacherous dangers that are on the road. Okay, that brings us to Anaya Mishnah. Yeah. What? So I explained the Tochacha. So therefore, let's say he doesn't have a torch. So there's a difference between daytime and nighttime. Nighttime, nobody sees him to be able to save him, but during the daytime, people will see him to save him.
Who are sighted.
Right. So therefore, we would also be like that. We would be like in Iver, the Ma'ayisim and Mashish, but Sarayim, that we would be completely helpless. Nobody would be able to. Nobody's able to help us. That's the idea. The same way that nobody's able to help a blind person. Excuse me. When it's pitch black and there's no torch and nobody sees him. Okay, the Mishnah, Kohen sheish biyado mumin. If you have a Kohen who has blemishes, a Kohen with blemishes should not tochen. He should not tochen because people are going to look, say, his blemishes on his hands. This is in the olden days when they didn't cover up their hands with the talesim, so people would stare at the hands and lo yisa is kapav, and either they would stare at the hands and they would distract them. That's the way Tosfos learns. Where Rashi says that if you look at the hands of the Kohanim, the person will lose their eyesight because the Shekhinah is Shaiva al Yedei and the Shekhinah resides on the hands of the Kohanim. Tosfos says that's only in the base of Mikdash. The Shekhinah is Shaiva al Yedei, and so here outside the base of Mikdash, more concerned people shouldn't be distracted. What?
Why do we care if it's one has a bummer? Look at any.
So that's the problem is that might cause people to look at the Kohen's hands. If he has a blemish, so people might not be able to control themselves from looking at the Kohen's hands.
They wear talis over their
And they didn't wear the talis over their hands in those days. They didn't wear the talis over their hands in those days. Nowadays, we wear the talis over our hands, so therefore we don't have the same concerns. So you know, therefore you shouldn't talk about and so too, if the Kohen, he worked in dyes, so therefore he had a dye on his hand, he had istis upua, he had woad or matter, the blue dye or a red dye on his hand, that would also cause a distraction. Therefore, he says kapav, therefore you shouldn't talk him, because people will look at him, according to Rashi, that they'll be harmed by looking at him because the Shekhinah resides on his hand, so according to Tosfos, it'll just cause a distraction. Gemara says, Tana, mumin she'amu, the fun of Yadav Raglav. The blemishes that we're talking about are blemishes where a person on the person's face, the Kohen's face, his hands, or even his feet, because as we know, the Kohen takes off his shoes so that the people, in the olden days, they didn't have socks either. So people would be able to look at the feet of the Kohanim, they'd see the blemishes. So Amar Yeshua ben Levi, Yadav Kanios, lo yisos kapap, he has freckles, like white freckles on his hands, he shouldn't dochen. Because that also would cause a distraction of people looking at the Kohen. Tanya Nami, we have a verse that says similarly, Yadav, so maybe Kohanim shouldn't wear fancy, very colorful socks that people might, look at either. Tanya Nami, Yadav Bohakinios, Lo Yisa Eskapa, Kohen has the hands that are very freckled, he shouldn't Dochen Akumos, or if his hands are crooked, Akusho, so they go off to the side, so he's not able to separate his fingers properly, the way the Kohanim are supposed to separate their fingers. So Yisa Eskapa, he also shouldn't dochen. I'm very fortunate because at one point in time I had a wrist injury and my hand actually was crooked. And the doctors at the time, I went to one sports doctor who said he's not going to operate on my hand because it was because he needed to touch a lot of different nerves, and he was afraid of harming my hand further. So it was better that I should just have a crooked hand for the rest of my life. But fortunately, I found a really top-notch surgeon who said that he had a new experimental type of surgery, and he put a rod in my hand. So I have like this rod over here in my hand. You can see it a little bit. And this was Dr. Melvin Rosenwasser. He was the doctor who operated on Ronald Reagan at one point in time, put a rod there, and Baruch Hashem, now the hand is 100% straight. It was a tennis injury that I fell on a tennis court. Actually the tennis court was itself somewhat crooked. The floor of the court was crooked, but they didn't tell people. Yeah. But I didn't sue because it wasn't my personality. But Baruch Hashem, I was able to get it fixed. So that was obviously an important thing because it says a Kohen who has a crooked hand is not supposed to duck him. So Amar Ravasi Chifni Ubishni Lo Yisa Eskapa. Ravasi said that if you have a person who is from Chifni, these are in places where people did not pronounce it from Haifa. They didn't pronounce from Ein Shei Haifa, where they didn't pronounce their words properly. Or Bishini, it was from the base of Bishni, from Beishan, where they also did not pronounce words properly. Though Yisas Kappa, you shouldn't duchen. Tayana Miyaki, Bryce also says if the Kohen is not going to say the words properly, you shouldn't duchen. And Maridin Lefnei Ateva, that you shouldn't have anybody lead the tzibur and davening, Loanshe Beishan, not the people from Beishan, Loanshe Beis Haifa, not those people from Haifa who don't know how to pronounce words. Loanshe Tibonim. Tibonim was also a place in the Galil, lower Galil, where people did not pronounce words properly. Because can you imagine such an outrage that they pronounce the olives like ayin, so the ayin alpin, and they pronounce the ayins like olives, and they didn't have that little guttural, noise that you make when you say ayins properly and annoy everybody. So that they don't know how to pronounce the words, but the letters properly. Nowadays, nobody distinguishes between olives and ayins, or hardly anybody does, so therefore it's not considered to be a problem for us. So Amalei Rabbi Chia to Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, Ilmali Atalevi. So Rabbi Chia said to Rabbi Shimon ben Levi, if you were a Levi, apparently he wasn't a Levi, he said, if you were a Levi, Ilmali with a yud means if you were, Ilmali with an aleph means if you were not. So if you were a Levi, Pasal Ata Mina Duchen, and then you wouldn't be allowed to ducha to sing on the platform with the other Levium because you have a very thick voice, which is annoying. Mishim Da'ave Kala. So he felt obviously a little bit insulted by that comment. Asa Amalei Lavua. So Shimon ben Rebbe told his father Rebbe, oh, guess what Rabbi Chia said to me? So Amalei, okay, yeah, you go back and you tell Rabbi Chia, Amalei Zil Emalai, tell him that he doesn't know how to pronounce words properly. So Kishatam Magia Eitza V'chikesi LaHashem, when he gets to the words V'chikisi LaHashem, that I wait for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Pasuk in Yeshayahu. So if he would ever get up and daven, he should never daven because the Ladim says if he would end up being a blasphemer because he pronounces his chesed like haze and would sound like behikisi instead of v'chikisi, which sounds like he's saying that he's going to actually get up and and whack and punch above, which would be a terrible blasphemous thing to say. So therefore, tell him that he also would be in trouble. So Amar Apuna, okay, good. So that's touche. So Tosfos says that we do find, however, in the Gemara Bava Metzia, that Rabbi Chia was actually asked to lead the tzibur in davening when there was a tainus. So he says, yeah, because it wasn't like he was incapable of pronouncing his chesed properly and his haste properly. It was just very difficult for him. So when he really needed to, he could push himself and pronounce it properly. So Amar Apuna, and there are other answers given as well. Amar Apuna is the Zavaga no Yisa Kappa. Apuna says that a person who cries constantly, tears constantly come out of his eyes, so he also should not duchen because it would be a distraction for the tzibur. But there was somebody who was in the neighborhood of Apuna, Paris Yade, and he would duchen despite the fact that he constantly had tears in his eyes. So we say, how dash b'yahava? He was somebody that people knew about, so they were very accustomed to him. So people are already accustomed to the individual, then it's not a distraction. Bryce also says along these lines, person is constantly crying, but if he was somebody that people were accustomed to, then it would be mutter. Tosa says the same thing applies to a Kohen who has blemishes on his hands. If it's somebody that people are very accustomed to, he's a known painter in the neighborhood or whatever, and therefore it's not a distraction for them, that would be okay. If a person was blind in one eye, he shouldn't duchen. There was somebody similarly in Rabbi Yochanan's neighborhood who was blind in one eye, but he duchen. So we say there too, we have the same svara. He was somebody who was well known in the community, and people were accustomed to him. So therefore, they wouldn't stare at him, despite the fact that his eyes looked a little different. Says similarly, generally a person is blind in one eye, so he might look a little strange to people. He shouldn't duchen because it would be a distraction. However, but if people are accustomed to him, it would be mutter. Again, nowadays, Kohanim cover their head, they cover their hands, and so forth. So these things are not considered to be problems. Rabbi Yehuda said that if a person has colors, dyes on his hand, he shouldn't duchen. if most of the people in the city, they're all like painters and they all have, dyes on their hands, so then for sure that would not be a distraction and that would be a mutter, that would be fine for them to duchen. Okay, next Mishnah, Naya Mishnah, only any over the Teva, but Sibanin, a person who says, I'm not going to dive in for the Yom because I'm wearing colored clothing. And say, what? What are you, that's weird. Right? Yeah, he's like, I'm wearing a blue shirt, so I shouldn't dive in front of the oven and say, what kind of religion do you have? Where did you come from? Obviously not Jewish, that. Okay, so Apolavadim lo yavers, we say no. That if a person really thinks that there's something wrong, with wearing, a colored shirt, so then there's like a little bit of apicorsis in him. He must be like a yeshiva guy or something. So you shouldn't allow him to daven for the tzibur, even if he's wearing white clothing, because Lamaisa, strictly speaking, there's nothing wrong with wearing colored clothing, believe it or not, when you're leading the tzibur in davening. The sandal ain't over. If a person says, I'm not going to wear a sandal, so he shouldn't lead the tzibur, even if he's not wearing anything. There's strictly speaking, a person could go yachef in front of the tzibur as well, but we don't allow him, if he thinks that there's something wrong about a sandal, we don't allow people to create a new religion for themselves. And therefore, somebody who does that, they create new restrictions. They should not lead the tzibur under any circumstances. Also, tfilaso agula. If a person makes his tefillin, instead of making it square and cubed, he makes it round. So if you make it round like an egg, and then it's like a sakana because it could push through to somebody's forehead somehow. Mitzvah, and they have not fulfilled the mitzvah, they're not going to be protected, like Elisha Baal Kanafayim during a time of sakana. What? Well, it's a halakha Moshe Sinai is supposed to be square, but we say that in addition to the fact that you're not yotzi the mitzvah, it's also a sakana if you're going to make it round because it could penetrate the skull. Nasna mitzvah, if you put the tefillin sharosh.
With sandals, do we need to wear socks when we're wearing sandals?
Technically speaking, it's considered to be more of mechubad when you don't daven barefoot. So technically, you could be yotze, but you're not really supposed to daven barefoot unless it's like Tisha B'av or whatever. So really, you should put something on your feet.
So sandals, they're talking about like Israeli sandals style with socks.
He's talking about like Israeli. Yeah, he's saying that there is no logic to why a person wouldn't daven with sandals, but he's saying that so they had like a bug in their head that they're not supposed to daven with sandals. So we say that because maybe it's not considered to be a respectful piece of clothing or something like that. So we say that that's nonsense. A person who has that hakpada shouldn't daven for the yom altogether. Good. So nasna mitzvah, if you put the tefillin sharosh on your metzach, on your forehead, and you read by you totafos ben enecha literally, and didn't follow the Torah Shabbat Peh, that it's supposed to go on the upper portion of the head, where with the head of the portion where there would be a recess in the head of a tinoch, of an infant, kind of on the upper portion above the forehead, and they put it on the forehead instead, or pas yado, or where with respect to the tefillin shel yad, they put it in on the actual hand, where it says al yadecha, and they interpreted al yadecha to mean on the hand, as opposed to our Torah Shabbat Peh interpretation that it means on the upper, muscle area above the elbow, between the elbow and the shoulder. Harezu derech haminus, so a person who wears the tefillin sharosh shel yad in this improper, literal fashion, without paying attention to the Torah Shabbat Peh, that's considered to be heretical, and we don't allow that. If a person took the tefillin and they overlaid the parshios with gold, as opposed to the leather of an animal, of a kosher animal, or they put the tefillin on their sleeves instead of hiding the tefillin, because it says l'chad os, that it's supposed to be an os, a sign for you, but not below l'achayim os. It's not supposed to be out there above your sleeve. It's supposed to be below the sleeve. It's supposed to be covered up the tefillin shell, the bias of the tefillin shel yad, but the person instead put it out there in the open above their sleeve. This is considered to be the way of outsiders, not necessarily heretical, but it means of people who follow their own judgment as opposed to the judgment of chachamim, and they don't pay attention to these various instructions of the chachamim, and that's also considered to be improper behavior, and maybe not on the same level of heresy, but also improper behavior. So says the Gemara, my time up. What's the reason we don't allow the person who insists on not davening with colored clothing from davening? So Chashin and Sheraminos Nizrukaba, we're worried that maybe this person is heretical and therefore he got some sort of an avodah zarah notion that you have to always wear white. Ha'oset tfilaso agula, if a person makes his tefillin round, it's a sakana vein bar mitzvah. So lema tanina lahas. So we have perhaps a raya for this from a brisa that says as follows: the Tana Rabbanan tefillin merubos halachal Moshe misinai. The fact that tefillin have to be completely squared and cubed, and they have to all the sides have to be exactly the same dimension. So that is halachal Moshe misinai. Rava, and Rava says, and this is true with respect to the stitches as well. The stitches have to also be squared. And they have to have a hypotenuse that follows the whatever Pythagoras theorem, that it has to be the exact amount of of the a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That has to be the exact dimensions that show that the two other sides were completely square, approximately 1.4, something in that range, in terms of the ratio. And otherwise it would be possible. So we see that you need an exact square in terms of the cube of the tefillin, and that it can't be round. So I'm sorry, the base has to be exactly square, 100% square. I'm a papa. I mean, it doesn't mean like with that, if you would take the most sophisticated measuring instrument and you walk by 0.0000001, that would be a problem. It means that like when you look at it according to like normal human measurements, it's within the same measurement. So I'm a papa, masnisin davida ki amaguza. So a papa said, no, it could be that the only time that the brisa would say that it's a problem is if maybe if you made it like a nut, if you made it like a walnut, so that would be a problem. But if it had sort of equal dimensions in terms of its roundness, so like it was like an egg or something like that, where it was sort of equally round on all sides, maybe that would actually be okay. And therefore, this brisa is not necessarily a raya for the principle in our Mishnah that it can't even be round like an egg, although of course that is the halacha. We'll just read the next couple of words because I like to get to the next page. Tovim erased the derech aminos on the same subject. If a person says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be blessed by the good people, that's considered to be heretical because we think that the bad people also have the right to daven and to bless the Kadosh Baruch Hu, just like in the ingredients of the Ketores. We had one foul-smelling ingredient, the chelbana, together with all of the sweet-smelling ingredients that we believe the Rishaim also have the right and the obligation to bless the Kadosh Baruch Hu as well, not only confined to the Tovim, but rather to all people. And we'll stop here. Okay.